The sheriff laughed when she cried in court. So the loner rancher took off his hat and stood behind her. The courthouse in Millbrook Territory was nothing more than a glorified saloon with a judge's bench, where the bar used to be. On this particular Tuesday morning in September 1887, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Outside, the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street, but inside the makeshift courtroom, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Sarah McKenna stood before Judge Horatio Blackwell's bench, her calloused hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper, the deed to her late husband's ranch. Her worn calico dress, faded from too many washings and patched at the elbows, told the story of a woman who had worked every day of her adult life just to survive. At 32, she looked older, weathered by the harsh realities of frontier life and the recent loss of her husband to consumption. "Your Honor," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "this deed clearly shows that my husband Thomas legally purchased the Broken Arrow Ranch from Mr. Cornelius Wade 3 years ago. We paid every cent we owed, worked that land from sunup to sundown, and built it into something worth having. Now that Thomas is gone, Mr. Caldwell here claims we never had clear title." She gestured toward the plaintiff's table where Jeremiah Caldwell sat with his lawyer, a slick-haired man from back east, who charged more for one day's work than most folks in Millbrook saw in a month. Caldwell owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and had his fingers in every profitable enterprise from the Mexican border to Denver. His black suit was impeccable, his boots polished to a mere shine, and his cold gray eyes held the calculating look of a man who took what he wanted and rarely heard the word no. Judge Blackwell, a portly man whose fondness for whiskey was evident in his red-veined nose and shaking hands, barely glanced at the deed Sarah held out. "Mrs. McKenna," he said in a bored tone, "Caldwell's attorney has presented compelling evidence that the original sale from Wade to your husband was conducted under questionable circumstances. It appears Wade was not the legitimate owner of that property when he sold it to you." "But, Your Honor, we have witnesses who have since left the territory or died," interrupted Caldwell's lawyer smoothly. "Most convenient, wouldn't you say?" Sheriff Buck Morrison, a man whose badge seemed to have grown heavier as his wallet grew lighter, lounged against the back wall with his arms crossed. He'd been on Caldwell's payroll for 2 years now, though he pretended otherwise for the sake of appearance. Morrison was the kind of lawman who looked impressive at first glance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a carefully waxed mustache and twin Colts on his hips. But his courage only extended as far as his employer's influence. Sarah's voice began to crack as she spoke. "Please, Your Honor, this ranch is all I have left. Without it, I have nowhere to go, no way to support myself. My husband and I put everything we had into that land. We cleared the brush, built the house and barn with our own hands, dug the well during the drought of it. It's our home." "Was your home, Caldwell," corrected coldly. "Property that was never legally yours to begin with." As Sarah continued to plead her case, her composure finally crumbled. Years of hardship, the pain of losing her husband, and now the prospect of losing everything they'd built together proved too much to bear. Tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks as she spoke about the small cemetery plot behind the house where Thomas lay buried, about the fruit trees they'd planted that were just beginning to bear, about the life they'd dreamed of building together. That's when Sheriff Morrison began to chuckle. It started as a barely audible snicker, but as Sarah's tears flowed more freely, his amusement grew more apparent. Soon he was shaking with poorly suppressed laughter, apparently finding great humor in the widow's distress. "Something amusing you, Sheriff?" Judge Blackwell asked, though his tone suggested he might share the humor. Morrison wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Oh, nothing, Your Honor. Just thinking about something I heard at the saloon last night." "Please, continue." But his laughter had the desired effect. Sarah's voice faltered completely as she realized that even the man sworn to protect the citizens of Millbrook territory found her suffering entertaining. The few townspeople scattered throughout the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none dared speak up. Caldwell's influence ran too deep, and crossing him meant economic ruin for anyone brave enough to try. Sarah stood there, shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The deed in her hands might as well have been blank paper for all the good it was doing her. The fix was in, as everyone in the courtroom knew, and she was powerless to stop it. That's when she heard the soft sound of boot heels on the wooden floor behind her. The footsteps belonged to a man most folks in Millbrook knew by sight, but few knew by name. They called him simply the Loner Rancher or sometimes Flint, though whether that was his given name or just what people had taken to calling him, nobody seemed certain. He ran a small spread about 15 miles north of town, kept to himself, and came into Millbrook only when absolutely necessary for supplies or occasional work. Flint was a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and lean as a strip of jerky, with prematurely gray hair that he kept trimmed short and steel blue eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His face was weathered to leather by years of sun and wind, marked by thin scars that spoke of a violent past he never discussed. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, a cotton shirt, leather vest, and well-worn boots. But everything about him was clean and well-maintained. His gun belt held a single Colt 145, that looked to be in perfect working order, though most folks had never seen him draw it. The man had arrived in Millbrook territory 3 years earlier, with a small herd of cattle, a pack horse, and enough money to buy a modest spread. It paid cash, asked no favors, and made it clear he preferred his own company to anyone else's. He worked his land alone, built his own buildings, and handled his own problems. The few times he'd been forced to interact with other people, he'd proven to be polite but distant, the kind of man who measured his words carefully and wasted none of them. Now, as Sheriff Morrison's laughter echoed through the courthouse, Flint walked slowly down the center aisle, his spurs chiming softly with each step, the only sound in a room that had suddenly gone quiet. When he reached the area just behind Sarah's chair, he stopped. Without a word, without any acknowledgement of the judge, the lawyers, or the other spectators. Flint reached up and removed his hat, a worn Stetson that had seen better days but was still shaped with care. He held it in both hands, at chest level, and took a position directly behind Sarah McKenna, close enough that she could feel his presence without being crowded by it. The gesture was simple, but in the context of frontier society, it spoke volumes. A man removing his hat in the presence of a lady was a mark of respect. Standing behind someone in a courtroom was a show of support. Doing both while a corrupt sheriff laughed at a widow's tears was nothing short of a public declaration that he stood with her against the forces arrayed against her. The effect was immediate and profound. Sheriff Morrison's laughter died in his throat, as if he'd been kicked in the gut. Greg Blackwell straightened in his chair, suddenly aware that the proceedings were being watched and judged by someone whose opinion carried weight, even if nobody could quite explain why. Caldwell's lawyer paused in his note-taking, and Caldwell himself turned to get a better look at this unexpected development. "Sir," Judge Blackwell said after a moment of uncomfortable silence, "this is a legal proceeding. If you're not directly involved in the case, I'll have to ask you to take a seat or leave the courtroom." Flint's response was measured and quiet, but in the stillness of the room every word carried clearly. "I'm exercising my right as a citizen to observe the proceedings, Your Honor. I'll stand where I choose to stand." There was something in his tone, not threatening exactly, but absolutely unmovably, that made Judge Blackwell think twice about pressing the issue. The Loner Rancher had broken no laws, violated no courtroom protocol. He was simply standing with his hat in his hands, but somehow that simple act had shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Sarah felt the change too. The knowledge that anyone was standing with her, gave her the strength to straighten her shoulders and wipe the tears from her cheeks. She took a steady breath and turned her attention back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice stronger now, "I've presented valid documentation proving my ownership of the Broken Arrow Ranch. If Miss Caldwell believes there's some flaw in the original transaction, then he should take that up with Cornelius Wade or Wade's estate. He cannot simply take property from me based on suppositions and convenient disappearances of witnesses." Caldwell's lawyer started to object, but Judge Blackwell held up a hand. The presence of the loner rancher had reminded him that this proceeding would be talked about throughout the territory, and not all of those conversations would be favorably to a judge who ruled arbitrarily against a widow. "Mrs. McKenna, while the court acknowledges your emotional attachment to this property, the legal questions surrounding the original deed are quite serious." "What legal questions?" The voice came from behind Sarah, quiet but carrying an edge that made several people in the courtroom shift nervously. Judge Blackwell's face reddened. "Sir, I've already told you. You've told me I can observe. I'm observing. And what I'm observing is a woman with a legal deed being told she has no claim to property. She and her husband worked for 3 years. I'm observing a sheriff who finds her distress amusing rather than concerning. And I'm observing a proceeding that seems to have reached its conclusion before any evidence was actually examined." The word hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Caldwell leaned forward in his chair, his cold eyes fixing on the man who dared challenge the carefully orchestrated proceedings. "And just who might you be to question the legal system of this territory?" Flynn turned his attention to Caldwell for the first time, and something in his gaze made the cattle baron's confident expression falter slightly. "Name's Flynn McReady," he said simply. "I own the Crow's Nest Ranch north of here." Several people in the courtroom exchanged glances. McReady. The name was vaguely familiar, though they couldn't quite place where they'd heard it. But there was something in the way he said it, not boastful, but matter of fact, that suggested it should mean something to them. Caldwell's lawyer had gone very still. He was from Denver, better connected to territorial politics and legal matters than the local folks, and the name McReady had triggered a memory that was making him deeply uncomfortable. He leaned over to whisper urgently in Caldwell's ear. Whatever he said made Caldwell's face go pale. The cattle baron studied McReady with new attention, taking in details he'd missed before, the way the man carried himself, the quality of his gun leather, the scars on his hands that suggested more than simple ranch wear. After a long moment, Caldwell sat back in his chair and gave his lawyer a barely perceptible nod. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, clearing his throat, "perhaps we've been somewhat hasty in this matter. My client is a reasonable man, and if Mrs. McKenna can provide additional documentation supporting her claim." "The documentation is right there," McReady said, gesturing to the deed in Sarah's hands. "She's provided a legal deed, signed and witnessed according to territorial law. If you want to challenge it, present evidence. Real evidence, not convenient suppositions." Judge Blackwell found himself in an impossible position. The fix had been in from the beginning. Caldwell had made it clear that ruling in his favor would be financially beneficial for the judge, while ruling against him would be problematic. But now there was this McReady character, whose mere presence had changed the entire dynamic of the courtroom. Sheriff Morrison, meanwhile, was doing his best to disappear into the wall behind him. The laughter that had seemed so appropriate minutes earlier now felt like a terrible mistake. Something about McReady suggested that laughing at a widow's tears was the kind of thing that might be remembered later. Under circumstances the sheriff preferred not to contemplate. Sarah, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, pressed her advantage. "Your Honor, I paid every cent my husband and I owed for this property. We have bank records showing the payments. We have the deed, and we have 3 years of tax payments on the land. If Caldwell wants to challenge Cornelius Wade's right to sell the property in the first place, that's a separate matter entirely. But he cannot take my land based on unproven claims about transactions that occurred before my husband and I were even involved. McRae's presence behind her was like having a mountain. At her back, solid, immovable, reassuring. She could feel his quiet strength, and it gave her the courage to continue fighting for what was rightfully hers. Judge Blackwell looked from Sarah to Caldwell to McRae, weighing his options. The smart man, he said, rule for Caldwell and deal with any consequences later. But McRae's presence suggested that consequences might be more immediate and personal than the judge was comfortable with. This court, he said finally, will take a brief recess to examine all documentation presented by both parties. It was a delaying tactic, nothing more, but it gave everyone in the room time to reassess the situation. During the recess, Caldwell and his lawyer had an urgent conversation, while townspeople whispered among themselves about the mysterious McRae and why his mere presence had changed everything. Sarah turned to thank the man who had stood behind her, but McRae was already walking toward the courthouse door. She hurried to catch up with him on the front steps. "Mr. McRae," she called, "I wanted to thank you for what you did in there." He paused and turned back to her, settling his hat back on his head. In the harsh sunlight, the scars on his face were more visible, and Sarah could see that this was a man who had lived through more violence than most people could imagine. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." McRae was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dusty street, where heat waves shimmered like ghosts. "Had a wife once," he said finally. "Lost her to cholera 10 years, but before that, we had a little place down in Texas. Nothing fancy, just a few acres and some dreams." He paused, his jaw tightening. "After she died, some men with lawyers and documents took it from me while I was laying her to rest. Say there were problems with the deed, irregularities in the purchase. Sound familiar?" Sarah felt her heart clench. "I'm sorry. I was younger then. And Guerrier, I handled it differently than I probably should have." His hand moved unconsciously toward his gun, then stopped. "Point is, I know what it's like to lose everything to men who use the law like a weapon. Wasn't about to watch it happen again if I could help it." "Who are you?" Sarah asked quietly. "I mean, really. Everyone in there seemed to know your name, but they were afraid of it." McRae studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Used to be a U.S. Marshal down in Texas and New Mexico territory. Made some enemies among the kind of men who think money and influence put them above the law. Eventually decided it was safer for everyone if I just disappeared and found a quiet place to raise cattle." That explained the gun, the scars, the way he carried himself, and the effect his name had on Caldwell's lawyer. Flynn McRae had probably been involved in some of the big cattle wars and corruption cases that had made headlines throughout the Southwest. "Will your being here today cause problems for you?" Sarah asked. McRae's smile was thin but genuine. "Ma'am, I've been dealing with problems my whole adult life. One more won't kill me." Before Sarah could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of boots on the courthouse steps. Sheriff Morrison was approaching, trying to look official despite the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. "McRae," he said, attempting a casual tone. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." "Morrison?" McRae's voice was neutral, but his eyes had gone cold. "Listen, about what happened in there, maybe I was a little out of line. Courthouse proceedings can be stressful. Sometimes a man needs to blow off a little steam, you know, by laughing at the widow's tears." Morrison's face flushed. "Now see here, I won't be lectured by some has-been lawman who..." He never finished the sentence. McRae had moved with startling speed, covering the distance between them in 2 steps. He didn't touch the sheriff, didn't threaten him, just moved into his personal space with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years dealing with dangerous situations. "Careful, Morrison," Macready said quietly. "You're walking a narrow line here. Might want to think about which side you want to be on when the dust settles." The sheriff's hand had moved instinctively toward his gun, but something in Macready's eyes made him freeze. This wasn't some drunk cowboy or small-time troublemaker he was dealing with. This was a man who had faced down killers and lived to tell about it. "No need for threats," Morrison said, taking a step back. "That wasn't a threat. That was advice. Free advice, which is more than you deserve." Before the confrontation could escalate further, the courthouse door opened and Judge Blackwell appeared. "Court is back in session," he announced, though his voice lacked the confidence it had held earlier. Back inside the courthouse, the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of Macready's identity had spread through the small crowd of spectators, and everyone now understood that they were witnessing more than just a simple property dispute. This was a test of whether justice could still prevail when powerful men tried to pervert it. Judge Blackwell called the squad to order and spent several minutes making a show of examining the deed and related documents. Finally, he looked up and cleared his throat. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he said, "This court finds that Miss Sarah McKenna holds clear and legal titles to the property known as Broken Arrow Ranch. Mr. Caldwell's challenge is rejected due to insufficient evidence." The decision sent a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Caldwell's face was thunderous, but his lawyer was already gathering papers and preparing to leave. Whatever research he'd done on Flynn Macready during the recess had convinced him that pursuing this matter further would be unwise. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. She'd won. Against all odds. Against Caldwell's money and influence. Against the corruption that had seemed inevitable, she'd won. As people began filing out of the courthouse, Sarah turned to thank Macready again, but he was already gone. She hurried outside and spotted him untying his horse from the hitching post in front of the general store. "Mr. Macready," she called, hurrying across the dusty street. He looked up from checking his saddle cinch. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you." "What you did in there. You won that case yourself," he interrupted. "You had the right documents, the right arguments. All I did was make sure you got a fair hearing." That's not how it felt. When Sheriff Morrison was laughing at me, when it seemed like nobody cared, she paused, searching for the right words. "You stood behind me when I had nobody else. That meant everything." Macready swung up into his saddle, but he didn't ride away immediately. "Mrs. McKenna, can I give you some advice?" "Of course." "Caldwell's not going to forget what happened here today. He's used to getting his way, and losing to a widow in front of half the territory is going to stick in his craw. You might want to consider hiring some help around that ranch of yours. Good help, if you know what I mean." Sarah understood. Caldwell would try other methods to get what he wanted. Methods that wouldn't involve lawyers and courtrooms. "I don't have money to hire gunmen, Mr. Macready." "It didn't say gunmen," said Goodhead. "There are plenty of decent men in this territory who've had their own troubles with Caldwell. Some of them might be willing to work for fair wages and a chance to do the right thing." He touched his hat brim again. "Good luck, Mrs. McKenna. I hope you get to enjoy that ranch in peace." As Macready rode out of town, Sarah stood in the dusty street, watching him go. She knew she'd probably never see him again. Men like that tended to disappear as quickly as they appeared. But she'd never forget what he'd done for her, or the lesson he'd taught her about standing up for what was right even when it seemed impossible. Behind her, Sheriff Morrison emerged from the courthouse, his badge catching the afternoon sun. He'd learned something today too, though whether it would stick remained to be seen. Caldwell followed a moment later, his face dark with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," Caldwell said as he passed Sarah on the boardwalk. "Yes, it is," she replied firmly. "The court has spoken. Courts can be influenced. Judges can change their minds." Sarah met his glare without flinching. Mr. Caldwell, I've lost a husband to consumption and nearly lost my home to corruption. I've cried my last tear over things I can't control. But I can control how hard I fight for what's mine. And I promise you, I'll fight as long as I have breath in my body. Something in her tone, perhaps the echo of Macready's quiet confidence, made Caldwell take a step back. The widow who had stood weeping before the judge that morning was gone, replaced by a woman who had found her strength. As the sun set over Millbrook territory that evening, Sarah McKenna rode back to her ranch, her legally recognized, court-certified ranch, with her head held high. She had work to do, preparations to make, and a new life to build. But she was no longer alone in the world. Somewhere out there was a man who had reminded her that justice was still possible, that decent people still existed, and that sometimes all it took was one person willing to stand up and do the right thing. The Broken Arrow Ranch would endure, not because of lawyers or judges or corrupt officials, but because a woman had found the courage to fight for what was hers, and a loner rancher had reminded her that she deserved to win. In the growing darkness, the lights of her small house beckoned like a promise of better days to come.